So good evening, everyone. This is our retrospective class. And it's been a pleasure having you with me for this whole series this year. So we have to kind of really remember, we have to really think back in terms of what we've been doing from the beginning of the year. And we started out talking about the difference between oracles and divination on the one hand and prophecy on the other, right? And the idea being that even that there's a general problem with divination being that you're kind of trying to interfere with the divine. You're kind of trying to open a window into the divine that maybe you shouldn't be opening. There are legitimate methods of divination like the ephod / Urim v'Tumim, right? There are ways that are considered legitimate, but they're not the connection with God and ongoing connection with God that prophecy provides. And in the cases where it's used instead of a prophet, we see kind of the limits, like with David, we see kind of the limits of using that kind of oracular statement. And again, just a reminder, as I always say when I talk about oracles, that oracles, both in the Bible and in the ancient Near East, are not like Greek oracles. They're not something that you can't escape, right? As something that tells you this is what's going to happen is saying this is what's going to happen if you don't do anything, right? It doesn't mean that this is what must happen even if you sell your child and send it to a different town and that he's not going to still marry your wife, right? If you take steps to prevent this thing that the oracle says is going to happen, it won't happen, or one hopes it won't happen. If they don't work like Greek oracles do. But still, it's considered most methods of divination are considered illegitimate. And again, it's because of that idea of you're getting into places you shouldn't be getting into, you're pushing buttons you shouldn't be pushing. You should be concentrating on this kind of dialogue with God through the prophet. And prophecy, of course, is this kind of ongoing, it is an ongoing dialogue, it is an ongoing relationship. If you recall, again, we looked at the beginning of the class, we looked at different types of prophets that we have, including the early prophets and ecstatic prophets. And I'm going to remind you in just a minute about what those prophets were like, what made something ecstatic prophecy. And then what we have in classical prophecy are book prophets, right? Yeshayahu, Yirmiyahu, Yechezkel, all of the 12 prophets, all of Tresar. Those are our classical book prophets, but the early prophets who are like Eliyahu and Elisha and others who we name, or Natan, they're prophets who deal a lot more closely they have a definition in terms of how they interact regularly with kings. They frequently, depending on who you are, right? At least in the North, they do miracles. These are things that are a basic part of what they do. Whereas once we get into classical prophets, they're not really miracle workers. And they also don't necessarily have an ongoing connection with a king, even if the king hates them. I'll remind you that with Eliyahu and Elisha, that even if the king hates them, he knows he's got to kind of connect with these prophets, right? And that's something basic in terms of, again, this is another thing we talked about, was the court prophet, as opposed to kind of the iconoclastic prophet. And what we see is when you're talking about early prophecy, even your iconoclast prophet is still dealing with a court, right? He's still expecting to talk to a king. Whereas when we talk about classical prophecy, he's not necessarily, he may be addressing a king, but he's not the same. There's that classical, and here we bring in the topic of false prophets. And I know I'm skipping on different topics, but this is our class to kind of bring these concepts together, right? Where we frequently have in early prophecy and in classical prophecy, this idea of the false prophet who says what the king wants to hear, right? And you can have a lot of prophets speaking together saying what the king wants to hear. And that doesn't stop. That's an ongoing phenomenon. to the extent where we have even explanations. So, for example, in Sefer Melachim, when we have it's a prophet who he's speaking against this large group of false prophets, he talks about it as if that God has actually sent a false spirit to lead the king astray by making all these guys prophesy falsely, right? So there's a real problem, and that in fact ends up being, and this is what I argued, this idea of false prophecy becomes so prominent that by the Second Temple period, there's a general feeling that a prophecy is false unless proved otherwise, as opposed to a prophecy is true unless proved otherwise. In other words, there's a real suspicion of anyone who gets up and says, I'm a prophet. Right. And we see that in Zechariah, when Zechariah says, a guy's going to say, oh, I was like beating myself up at my friend's house, rather than say, or my mistress's house, depends how you interpret it. I was, doing weird stuff, as opposed to saying I was a prophet, because it will be so shameful to say I'm a prophet. Right. And there's this idea. And again, when we get looking at later Second Temple texts, it really seems like there's a general idea that most people who say they're prophets are false prophets. So if you want to say someone's speaking the truth, you're much less likely to call him a prophet. It's something we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls, is that they don't call what they do prophecy, because they use the term prophecy to talk about false prophets who are on the other side, right? So not that there are no people who are considered true prophets in the time of the Second Temple period, but they are few and far between, and the assumption is that they're false. That's why, again, if we're talking about Second Temple period, that's why, or I should say the return to Zion, that's why it's so easy for Nehemiah to say to a prophet, you are lying to me, you're trying to trick me and get me to sleep in the temple precincts, right? You're just a liar, right? And while calling this guy a prophet. And to go back to our ecstatic prophets, because I didn't say what, so our ecstatic prophets, true or false, in general, these ecstatic prophecies are usually you know them by the use of the verb form, the hitba'el, for niba, mitnabe. He's mitnabe. He didn't just say a nibu'ah. He didn't just say a prophecy, he was mitnabe. He was had this ecstatic prophetic experience. And we see a very mixed approach to whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. Is it a good thing to have ecstatic prophets, or is it a bad thing to have ecstatic prophets? And we see that in the story of Shaul, of Saul himself, who in the beginning of his path towards kingship, he meets a group of ecstatic prophets and starts to prophesy himself. And they have this question, oh, is Shaul also among the prophets? And then at the end, when he's kind of going crazy and he's trying to get David, he also meets a group of ecstatic prophets. He starts to prophesy. He takes off his clothes. He's dancing around naked. It's very shameful. And people say, is Shaul also among the prophets? So we're in the saying in the beginning, it's like, who knew? Is Shaul also among the prophets? Because this is on his way to kingship. Where at the end of his kingship, it's like, oh, really? Oh, is Shaul also among the prophets? And this shows kind of that mixed attitude also to these people who are having ecstatic prophecy. Is this something real? Or is this something just weird that they're going into this ecstatic thing? We see this also in the story in the Torah when we have Eldad and Medad. If you recall, Eldad and Medad, they get prophecy in the camp, and they are also apparently going into something like an ecstatic prophecy. Joshua goes to Moshe, and he says, hey, Eldad and Medad, they're prophesying in the camp. They're not supposed to prophesy in the camp to people. They're prophesying because all of the elders got the sudden prophecy, right? But all the elders are in the right place for it. They're in the area of the tabernacle, whereas Eldad and Medad are still in the camp. And he says they're prophesying in the camp. And Moshe says, I wish everyone could let everyone get prophecy. That would be great, right? So that's a very positive attitude. And you see, Yoshua has a negative attitude. You see that there's constantly this tension between, is this a good thing? Is ecstatic prophecy a good thing or a bad thing, right? Are they for real? Are they not for real? Is it good? Is it bad? What it does seem to be is that they don't provide particularly useful prophecies, right? It's a certain type of prophetic experience that is not particularly practical for people who need a true prophecy, because that's also something that the false prophets do when they're doing things all as a group to kind of show that they're really getting a revelation. Now, speaking of revelation, we talked about also the classical prophets have this kind of, as well as Moshe, right? As well as Moses in the Bible, they have a certain pattern to their dedication as a prophet. And that pattern usually is that they're of course get a revelation from God that they need to be a prophet. God has chosen them. There's an initial refusal at some point. Oh, I'm not worthy. Oh, why me? Like that. There's initial refusal, and God's like, no, it's you, and this is your role. This is what you're going to do. And frequently, that role includes the knowledge that you will not be listened to. The people will not listen to you, or in Moshe's case, power will not listen to you. Right? They won't listen to you, all right? But you need to go and prophesy because that's your job, okay? And maybe they will listen to you, or for sure they won't listen to you, but this is your job. You must prophesy. Now, and in fact, we saw that the prophet's job is something that really that concerns prophets such as Amos, Yechezkel. They talk about what is the meaning. What is the prophet's job? What is the meaning of being a prophet, right? And even Yirmiyahu, there's a sort of inevitability. There's an idea that if you receive a prophecy, you can't not say it, right? Whereas Amos presents it as part of almost the divine causality. In other words, it's a basic part of, if you see something happen, that means God was behind it. And if God was behind it, he's for sure going to tell his prophet. So it's part of the causality of the universe. Prophecy is part of the causality of the universe, right? You can't tell a prophet not to prophesy. He must prophesy. And of course, Amos has that in his personal life where he's told, don't prophesy or go somewhere else and prophesy there. And he's like, no, I'm not one of these court prophets. I'm the real deal. And my job is to prophesy to you or here. I see that there is there a comment? No, there's not. Okay, so and if we look at Yechezkel has this idea of the watchman, right? He is the watchman. He has to be on the wall and warn people of what's coming. If he doesn't warn people of what's coming and the city falls, it's his fault. If he warns people and they don't listen, it's their fault, right? And that's Yechezkel's job. Yechezkel's job is to tell them, even if they won't listen. Excuse me. Now, of course, this is a very difficult job because this is a basic part of classical prophets' kind of existence, is that people don't listen to them. The exception being the prophets of the return to Zion, right? The prophets of the return to Zion, in particular, Zechariah and Haggai and Zechariah. Malachi, we don't know whether he was listened to or not. So Haggai and Zechariah are the guys who speak up and say, hey, it's time to build the temple. Build the temple already. We should be building the temple. And they are listened to probably because they're getting close to the 70 years that Yirmiyahu prophesied about from the initial exile. And so it's considered the right time, that this is really the time that the temple must be rebuilt. We spoke in one of our classes about whether this return to Zion was considered the redemption, right? Was this considered like the Messiah? In a way, the Messiah, was this considered this promised redemption, this promised new age? If you recall, this is something we also talked about. We have in Yirmiyahu and in Yechezkel and in others, this idea that in the coming eschatological period, I hate calling it Messianic age because it doesn't always have a Messiah at the center, right? There's not always a leader who's supposed to be the guy. Even sometimes when it says, oh, and David will rule, but that's part of it. It's not like David's going to lead us to this, or a lead, or a descendant of David is going to lead us into this new age. The idea is that will have this new age and will have a ruler, right? So this new age, part of what needs to happen is that there has to be an internal change in the nature, in how Israel sees sin, right? There's a change of heart, right? In the words of the Gospels, they exchange a heart of stone for a heart of flesh, right? They have to go through an internal change so that they don't sin again. Why? Because the way the prophets see the time from the Exodus is this kind of constant sinning. Now, it's either after, like, with some of them, like with Hosea, the time in the desert is the honeymoon period. Like, we should be going back to that time in the desert and renewing this beautiful, loving relationship with God. And for others, like Yechezkel, we're sinning from the second we get out of Egypt, right? We just start sinning and we don't stop, right? So the question is, okay, great. So you sinned until you were exiled. Now God brings you back. Now what? You're going to sin again. And that's why there needs to be this change. That's why both Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, and Yechezkel, Ezekiel talk about this internal change that has to happen. And then so the question is, so given that, is the return to Zion, is that this great, wonderful return from the exile? And it's certainly, in terms, if you look at how Haggai and Zechariah are talking about it, they are talking about entering really a messianic age with the person leading it, right, being Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel is the ruler. He's the Pecha. He's a descendant of the Davidic line, and he is going to take us into this new age with a temple, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. However, he seems to disappear, right? Does he disappear, or is this simply the result of Ezra and Nehemiah? Because if you read the book of Ezra and Nehemiah has a very different approach. It doesn't center at all on Zerubbabel. It doesn't center. Zechariah talks in these, especially the end of Zechariah, talks about this miraculous eschaton, this miraculous end, or you could say even horrific, because bad things happen in Jerusalem, right? And so this is something that you're not gonna miss. It's major. But for Ezra and Nehemiah, for the most part, the promised redemption is their current existence, which is the return to the land of Israel under Persian rule. We have an autonomous entity that's part of the Persian Empire. That's what God, with a temple and a built-up city of Jerusalem, that's what God promised. Okay, much more kind of practical, but certainly this seems to be, in other words, they're putting all their ideas of redemption into what they're building now. So if we go back to what I said before about Zechariah and this kind of really apocalyptic happening in Jerusalem, that fits with the day of the Lord, right? Yom Hashem. That is an idea, and I'm talking now. I'm getting into more of some of the concepts. We already covered a couple. So the concepts we talked about with the prophets, where the day of the Lord is a concept that all the prophets are almost all the prophets they're aware of, and they're using or not using or arguing with. Now I want to note here, there are a couple of things that really point to certain ideas that are really basic to everyone, especially, for example, Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus, right? It's so strong, especially in the Northern Kingdom, and you can see how strong it is by the fact that the prophets need to argue with it, right? Amos is like, yeah, don't think you were so special because you came out of Egypt, right? Because this is a basic part of their self-definition, right? Hosea rewrites the story in a way of Yaakov and of what it meant to come out of Egypt. So these are certain things that everyone shares as a very important, meaningful idea. Another one of these is the day of the Lord. That's the day that's coming at a time we will defeat our enemies and everyone will worship God. That is an idea that we can see is it crosses the Northern Kingdom, Southern Kingdom border. It's something that it involves a variety of elements generally. One is that it's not easy. One is that they're talking about something fairly apocalyptic. So that's what Amos argues. Amos says, why do you guys want the day of the Lord? It is a day of darkness and not light, right? Why are you so excited about this thing? It's not going to be good, right? Part of the reason he's saying it's not going to be good is because they are not good, right? They're not being good people. But also the idea is it's kind of disastrous. It really is kind of this apocalyptic event. It's this major battle. And okay, at the end, God's enemies are vanquished, the nation's enemies are vanquished, but there's possibly pretty bad stuff leading up to that. We see that really very strongly in Zechariah, right, where half the city is taken into captivity. Women are raped. Like it's really horrible. And that's on the way to this final conclusion. And then the idea is that the nations are judged. Nations are judged. The people is judged, but mainly nations, right? And then in the final analysis, everyone acknowledges kind of the rulership of God. Of course, an exception to this being Micah. Micah says everyone's just going to follow their own God and everyone's going to be cool. So that's also something that's very, very central in the in kind of the way the prophecies of the future are structured. Not all of them. So for example, right, Yeshayahu talks about this period of peace, right? You're gonna turn swords into plowshares, whereas Yoel, who's reacting to that prophecy of Yeshayahu, says, no, you're gonna turn plowshares into swords, right? Yoel likes that good old-timey really visceral day of the Lord. No peace for Yoel. Yoel sees everything as like a battle. Just remind you, Yoel is the one that talks about locusts, right? They've got locusts, and then you've got the day of God. That's Yoel. So locusts are an army, and they are parallel to what we can expect in the apocalyptic battle leading up to the day of the Lord. Some other things that we covered, I can see people are fading a little. I can pause for questions if you like before reminding you of our last few topics. Anyone? Questions? Yeah, go ahead, Yafa, go ahead. I can't hear you, you're on mute. Yeah, Yafa, you're on mute.
Yeah, okay, I think, did I unmute myself now?
Yeah,
yes. Yeah. Okay, I was just wondering what happened to all the false prophets of the Second Temple period. Were they put on trial, or were they just too scared to announce themselves?
Right. That's a good question. So I think that there are prophets who people eventually considered false. They probably didn't do much to them. My guess is once you get to the Second Temple period, there's this the same way if someone came and you're like, he's kind of a kook or he's kind of a swindler, but whatever, he lied and you don't believe him. I think that people who were once you get to the Second Temple period, I don't think they were putting people to death for things like that. The big question is, were they ever putting people to death for things like that? That brings me actually to, if we talk about Yirmiyahu's trial, right, which we learned together. So in Yirmiyahu's trial, we see that they're putting him on trial for false prophecy because he's saying something that can't possibly come true, until they're like, well, but it could just be a call for our repentance. Of course, it can't come true, but maybe he's just calling for us to repent so that, of course, the temple won't be destroyed. And that's the way he is freed. And there's someone else with a similar prophecy who runs away to Egypt and is caught and brought back and killed. Now the question is, of course, was that person who's brought back and killed, was he killed for false prophecy, or was he really killed for treason? Right? If the king wants to rebel and this guy's saying, no, we can't rebel, and he's making a big fuss out of it, Like, it doesn't sound like that guy got much of a trial. It sounds like that guy just kind of got caught and killed. So it seems like, and even when, so like when Yirmiyahu argues with I think it's Hananel, right, who breaks the yoke from his neck, he just says to him, okay, like, I hope you're right, but you can't say good prophecy and have it not come true and be considered a true prophet. Nothing happens to him from people. He dies, God kills him. So I'm not sure how it would be. It's hard. It's hard when someone says something good is going to happen and it doesn't happen, and they say, well, maybe it'll happen next year. And we did mention, and again, this comes back to one of the things we talked about, which was what happened about all these prophecies that don't come true from our true prophets, right? Yechezkel is like, okay, it's going to fall, and it doesn't fall, right? He's like, you're going to take, Tyre and Sidon, and he says no, and Yechezkel says he did it. I still remember my distress on reading it. I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, oh, and since Nebuchadnezzar, because that was hard, he's going to get Egypt, right? And I'm like, what do you mean it was hard? You just said God was going to do it. Like, well, what does that mean it was hard, right? but it doesn't happen. So there doesn't seem to be, that's not enough to say that he's a false prophet, right? That specific thing, those specific things are like, okay, they didn't happen, right? And Yirmiyahu has similar things, particularly, but also these prophecies about other nations are also much less important to people in terms of, are they going to come true or not? Because they don't really affect the people of Judea at the time. And again, when you have a prophecy is saying, okay, we're all going to come back, well, when is that going to be? Not when when Yirmiyahu says 70 years, it's not when he's going to be alive, right? So these things, it's unlikely that someone was put to death for false prophecy particularly often. And that's what I think. If we go back to the rules of prophecy, it's another thing that we discussed, which was that we have these rules of prophecy, the way they're set out in Deuteronomy and Devarim, where it's just like, if a prophet's word doesn't come true, then he's a false prophet. Or if he says to worship other gods, he's a false prophet, right? Or he says to not follow God's word, he's a false prophet. But in terms of something not coming true, the question is, well, how long are you supposed to wait, right? And that becomes something that makes it very hard to judge a true or false prophet. And I think that the difficulty of that is one of the things that kind of contributes to kind of the end of prophecy, as it were. Can contribute to this idea that, we can't rely on prophets. The question is, of course, how they did rely on prophets for a really long time. So that's always what I wonder. And part of it was like, maybe that a regular person probably didn't go to a prophet very often. The king did, right? And the king had a bunch of prophets. So like, he had a bunch of prophets, and the prophets also functioned as advisors. And we see that with Natan and David, where Natan is really functioning not just as a prophet, but as a court advisor, right? He's getting involved in matters, in royal matters of the family. So that, and so there, someone who's prophesying isn't just prophesying in a vacuum. He knows what's going on. We see that a little bit with Yirmiyahu as well, because Yirmiyahu, there are certain people, there's certain kind of ministers on the inside who are on Yirmiyahu's side, because they're kind of the pro-Babylonian ministers. They're the ones who are like, yeah, let's not rebel, right? And they're the ones who can kind of help him out a little bit. So you have that interesting kind of interplay of the prophet and the court, even when the prophet is not one of these, court prophets. And again, we see the huge number of court prophets that it talks about. It seems to talk about more in the northern kingdom during the time of Eliyahu and Elisha. But we do hear them talked about in Yirmiyahu as a power group, right? You have the kind of the officers and the priests and the prophets and the nation. And the priests and the prophets are both very important power groups in Jerusalem during the time of Yirmiyahu that are really affecting they're really affecting Yirmiyahu's life. If you read through the book of Yirmiyahu, you see these power groups come up more and more often. And that, I think, and I've said this before, that when when in Yirmiyahu's trial, when they quote the verse from Micha, when the elders quote the verse from Micha, you're absolutely meant to remember the context of that verse in Micha, which is a rebuke of the prophets and the priests and the leaders for being false and conniving and corrupt, right? And you're absolutely supposed to remember the context of that particular verse. And another thing that we talked about was prophecy and empire. So again, we discussed about how there's this general idea about how as empires rose, that was kind of the need for prophecy to explain how you could have this empire sweeping. Someone's not on mute. Someone is not on mute. Everyone mute yourselves, please. Okay, thank you. Going back. So there used to be a general idea in scholarship, which I don't think is that common anymore, which is that prophecy arose as a response to, or I should say classical prophecy, book prophecy, or prophecy of that kind, rose as a response to the rise of empire. Because when you have an empire sweeping through nations, it looks like that empire's God is the better God, and you need an explanation of how that's not true. But what we saw was that prophecy, in fact, for Israel begins much earlier than that. And when Amos, for example, is prophesying, he doesn't even see empire on the horizon. He's not talking about Assyria at all. It's not even coming up, right? With Hosea, it is coming up a little bit more. But the fact is, it's not just for that. And we also saw that a lot of what these prophets are talking about doesn't have to do with empire. It's simply not connected to empire. Of course, towards the destruction, it does become much more of a thing where, Nebuchadnezzar has been sent by God, or Assyria, it's because everyone sinned, right? So it's a common explanation, but it's not the main. It's not even the main thing frequently that the prophets are talking about. Finally, we talked about the attitude towards sacrifice and prophecy. And what we saw was that a big part of the problem with sacrifice for the prophets is that it's used as an easy out for people who have strayed from the path in terms of what they're doing to other people. In other words, I can be corrupt, I can, smash the poor, and then I bring my sacrifice or I do my fast and I'm fine. And the prophets are very much against that. They would not want there to be no sacrifice whatsoever, but they're saying the sacrifice isn't the important thing. It's not the main thing. God wants you to follow in his ways. And we did note that that is something that would have been very unusual, as far as I know, in the ancient Near East. In other words, while you would have this belief, and you do see it in, and I mentioned, for example, the Hittite king prayers, where there is this idea that the gods, you want us to be moral, but it's also clear that the gods need sacrifices because they got to eat, right? And that's why in the Hittite king prayers, when he wants the gods to get rid of this plague, first he says, if my father sinned, I didn't sin, I'm not doing the bad things he did if he did them. And then he says, if you kill off all the people, there's no one to bring sacrifices, like guys. Right. So, he uses both arguments, and with the classical prophets, there's a real problem that people think that they can do whatever they want and then just do the rituals to get themselves out of it. And that is not what God wants. Now, we saw that the exception to this rule of not liking sacrifices so much, or de-emphasizing sacrifices, let's say, is Malachi. Malachi is very, very concerned with sacrifices. He's speaking at a time when people are not bringing the sacrifices the way they should. It's the beginning of the Second Temple. And his main concern really is that people are disrespecting God and not considering God the real ruler by not bringing the correct sacrifices. I see that a question or comment has come in. Elisa asks, what caused the transition between the story prophets, Eliyahu, Elisha, etc., to the book prophets? You said it's not the rise of empire, but what was it? That is a good question. I actually think of them in parallel. Like, I don't think of them as one ended and the other began. I think it's probably more of a question of why do we have, so Eliyahu and Elisha are the prophets that we learn about in narrative, right? They're functioning prophets. They're doing things with kings. They're doing miracles. And then when we have book prophets, the big question is, how did we get these books from these prophets? And that really is a question. They all, we know that Yirmiyahu had a scribe, right? Baruch was his scribe. He had a scribe to write things down. How do we get Amos's prophecies, for example? Did he write them down? Did someone else write them down when he was saying them? How much of this did he actually say, and how much of this did he write, right? Because, like, for example, with Yirmiyahu, we can really look at certain prophecies where it seems like a couple of verses sound like just the sort of thing that you could say to a group of people, and then the expansion maybe is something that you could write later, right? So this is really the question, is not just why do we have book prophets, who's writing it down? Who's writing it down? Who's copying it? Who's keeping it? Who's passing it down? And I would say probably it's more the rise of reading and writing being more common. This is a guess of mine. That contributes to this whole idea of book prophets. You have a prophet where you have a book of his prophecies, as opposed to just like little notes saying, on such and such a day he said this, right? On such and such a day, like he said, the waters will split, like that, which is what you would see if you're looking at ancient Near Eastern prophecies. You'll say such and such said to the king that on such and such a day, this king was going to attack, or don't trust these guys with their treaty. You don't have, right? You don't, in general. I want to say you don't have these long prophecies, but of course, in the Bilam inscription, you actually do have this kind of poetic, what seems to be some kind of poetic prophecy about death or something, like some apocalyptic end or something like that. It's very fragmentary, right? So I'm not saying that it comes out of nowhere. And in fact, Cassuto famously looked at Amos and found patterns in Amos that echoed patterns in Ugaritic literature, right? But I think that that's a big part of it. It's the literary, it's kind of the literary evolution is what allows for book prophets, as opposed to I think when you have book prophets, and you can see this even in Yirmiyahu, you still have what you could call early prophets kind of wandering around. You've got other people who aren't the book prophets and aren't functioning like book prophets, right? They're prophesying to kings, they're making statements to people, maybe they're trying to do miracles, who knows? But you have these book prophets which is kind of a literary evolution that allows for book prophets, I think, is what happens. Was that clear enough? At least a little rambling, but I hope it was okay. How do I know there was a literary revolution? Just because we have the books. If you say to me, well, Amos was written in the Second Temple period, then I don't have a lot to say. And absolutely people will say that, right? There are absolutely people will be like, well, what are you talking about? You're actually placing Amos in the time, more or less in the time of Amos. You're placing Yechezkel more or less in the time of Yechezkel. You are a fool. And it's true. If you say, well, Amos was actually written in the Second Temple period, then I absolutely cannot say that there was a literary revolution around that time. And I didn't say revolution, I said evolution. If I said revolution, it was a slip of the tongue. It was an evolution, I feel. And this is, in fact, one of the things, I'm pretty sure Cassuto said this, but if not Cassuto, then it was someone else continuing his work, said that the beauty, for example, of Amos's language doesn't come out of nowhere, right? The beauty is building on certain literary conventions that had already been developed far beyond the Ugaritic. I'm not big on Ugaritic poetry. Ugaritic stuff doesn't come close to Amos, right? And the idea is that Canaanite poetry, for example, had developed, and things had developed, and then you have the book prophecy, which could build on this kind of literary background in terms of prophecy, right? So you have this beautiful poetic prophecy that you didn't have before. Right. So I wouldn't say revolution, I would say more evolution. And we don't know what books were lost. We don't know what people writing down. You also, it is always, you always do wonder how much was said, how much was just written, who wrote it, how did it get passed down. One of the things I always say in terms of Amos and Hosea, because they were in the Northern Kingdom, now Amos, you could say, well, he went back to Yehuda, maybe, but Hosea, it's clearly written to the northern kingdom. So how do we still have it in a Judean Bible, right? Because it's a long time between the Assyrian exile and the Judean exile, and they're keeping it, right? So either people who were escaping from the northern kingdom, people did in fact escape from the northern kingdom from the Assyrian exile and went south to Jerusalem, so in Judea. So it's very possible that people escaping from that went, and they took this book because it came true, right? Because Hosea warned them, and look what happened, right? So they took this book with them, and it became a very important part of the canon. You could say the same for Amos, right? Or people traveling from Judea, because of course both there were many people going back and forth between the kingdoms. People from Judea thought that these books were important enough to keep. And they always say, well, why? How do you know? How would you be sure that Yechezkel is this true prophecy that you must keep when you've got chapters in there that don't come true, right? That he says didn't come true. And again, this brings us back to the whole question of canonization, because and we always have to be careful when we use this word, because it means something different frequently to Christian scholars than it does to Jews and Jewish scholars. Because to Christians, it usually means being an official part of a list of books. Like they had Council of Nicaea, which are our holy books. We never had that. We made up this Council of Yavna thing. It's completely made, like it was an academic construct, right? What we had were books that everyone knew had to be in. And then there were books that were on the edge. The books that were on the edge, like Shir Shirim, Song of Songs, that was on the edge. Esther was on the edge, right? We can tell from the Gemara, but it also makes sense. Daniel, the question is, how did Daniel get in? Good question, right? But books like Yechezkel, Yirmiyahu, Yeshayahu, everyone knew that these books had to be in. They were such an important part already of what Jews read and knew by heart, right? And part of that, and that actually connects to our last class, which the recording isn't up yet. It will be soon.
Miriam?
Yes.
Am I correct in thinking there is an implication that at least the earlier prophecies of Yirmiyahu were actually recorded by the king's own scribe? Because it said that the scribe of Yehoiakim was Gemariyahu ben Shaphan, who was also a good friend of Yirmiyahu. So the implication that he also recorded the prophecies of Yirmiyahu.
I don't know, like he actually has a scribe, like Yirmiyahu has Baruch, and we actually have a story where Baruch is sent with a prophecy to the king, right? He writes it down, he goes to the king with it. So Yirmiyahu is actually the one where we have the most description of how something's written down, right? Which is interesting. Can we take it at its like, is this exactly the way it always worked? Because in that case, he's told specifically, have him write it down, have him bring it to the king, and then the king, of course, famously, he throws in the fire, right? He throws in the fire, and that is, that's in particular, and this is something that they say when you're living in a time where being literate is not taken for granted, and we don't know whether being literate is taken for granted or not in this time. Like it's very hard to know because there are good arguments both ways. If you're living at a time where being literate is not taken for granted, burning a scroll is a big deal because writing is almost magic, right? And so there's this thing that you've gotten something written in a scroll and you burned it. How dare you? Oh my God, right? So that's even worse. But with Yirmiyahu, we really do have, he actually does have a scribe. And one of the things that scholars have said is that, oh, well, we know about his scribe because he was illiterate. But I don't know. I mean, Baruch is a character, right? He's Baruch ben Neriah. He's clearly supposed to be someone you know. Like I think he's someone who's relatively important. He can go to court. He gets his own prophecies because God's like, oh, I hear you say that that you're complaining. Just be lucky that you're alive. Like he seems kind of a more important character than perhaps we realize. And on that note, in terms of like, if we're talking about prophecies that seem that have a tremendous impact on future generations of Jews. So we can look at in our last class, we looked at Yechezkel and the dry bones. And we talked about how that prophecy of the dry bones becomes something much more than well, actually, it's pretty strong in context also, because in context, it's talking about the renewal of the nation and the return of the nation to its land, despite the fact that you feel that you are dry bones and have no hope and no life in you. And God is promising, I will bring you out of your graves and I will bring you to the land of Israel. In other words, it doesn't matter how dead you feel, I will renew the nation will be renewed. And besides the echoes that we get, in the Israeli national anthem, but it becomes this major force in terms of the belief in resurrection that becomes a basic Jewish belief, a resurrection at the end of days. And that's a literal reading of the dry bone story. We already see this kind of reading in the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? That we looked at last week in pseudo Ezekiel, where it's the resurrection of the righteous at the end time. And this is how they'll get their reward, which they did not get in their first life. So that was our last class. And I'm sure that I've missed some of the things that we covered, because this is our 30th class on the topic this year. Yes, indeed. And so we covered quite a bit. So again, thank you all for joining me. It's been a real pleasure. And keep in touch with what we're going to be, when we're going to be meeting again in September, and what we're going to cover. Remember, 2 classes on Concubine of Gibeah, part 1, part 2, but there's still some slots open, so please send your suggestions.